It's grand to welcome you all again to the Working Class Movement Library's series of Invisible Histories talks. Today, we're very pleased to introduce Matt Roberts from Sheffield Hallam University, whose topic is Ever Present to the Progressive Mind, Heritage Politics and the Memory of Chartism in England and Wales, 1918 to 20. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there is a donate button on our website. Matt, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Great to be here and to see so many of you this afternoon, in inverted commas. I'm going to show you something this afternoon that, as an Anorak historian, I'm particularly pleased about, which is I managed to find a source, a primary source, on eBay for the princely sum of £20. So I think it's priceless. But I'm going to show you something that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist anywhere else, which is part of today's theme. And today's theme is me looking at the afterlife of Chartism. I've worked quite a lot on the Chartists themselves, the mass working class movement for democratic rights in Britain in the 1830s and 40s. And if you'll allow the plug, my book that came out last year, it looked at the way in which the Chartists invented their own tradition, pantheons of heroes, of people like Thomas Paine and William Cobbett. But since completing that project, I've become more interested in how the Chartists were remembered, as it were, after Chartism, posthumous Chartism, if you like, or Chartism living on in memory. And it's that theme that I want to talk to you about today. This is new research. It's part of a broader project, and in the broader project, I'm gonna block out Michael Gove. I never thought I'd have a picture of Michael Gove in my presentation, but he's there for a reason. You'll see in a minute. I think there are three memories of Chartism that have existed really since the movement went into decline in the 1840s. The first and most familiar to historians of the movement is the Fabian view. Can you still see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just asking because I've switched to something else that I can read. So the first of these memories and the most familiar to historians is the Fabian view. The early 20th century Fabians, the intellectual wing of the Labour Party, saw in the Chartism of William Lovett's London Working Men's Association an early anticipation of their own gradualist political ideology. The Fabian view also tended to play down the image of Chartism as an expression of working class consciousness, in which workers and gentlemen radicals had cooperated, while simultaneously it also distanced Chartism from socialism. So that's the first memory. The second memory is that of a militant, class conscious, internationalist, and occasionally violent movement. According to this view, Chartism was a confrontational, anti-capitalist movement of an incipient socialist proletariat. And a range of groups to the left of mainstream Labour, and I'm using Labour with a capital L there, a range of groups to the left of mainstream Labour have invoked this memory of Chartism as part of their campaigns to distance themselves from the Labour Party and sketch out an independent, often working class politics. So that's the second memory. The third way in which memory of Chartism has been invoked is less explicitly party political, though it has often been central to attempts by the establishment to co-opt the movement in the late 20th century. And in this rendering, Chartists were premature, far-sighted liberal Democrats with lowercase L and D there. And in this reading, divested of its radical and especially socialist edge, the Chartists have been appropriated for a Whig and more recently Tory interpretation of history. And according to this view, Chartists were worthy but dull reformers who form part of a longer, gradual and peaceful narrative about the extension of the franchise and liberal democracy in this country. Now, while the boundaries between these three memories were not always clear-cut, the many contests over the memory of Chartism, I want to suggest, have pivoted around conflict between these three competing narratives. My purpose in today's talk is neither to provide a chronological account of the fluctuating fortunes of posthumous Chartism, if you like, nor is it to track shifting perceptions of Chartists, of the Chartist movement in the historiography, though I will touch on these aspects. Rather, my focus will be on several areas that illuminate issues central to the politics of heritage, the invention of tradition, and commemoration in popular movements. Now, the historiography, that written by academic historians on commemoration and heritage, is still largely weighted towards what you might call official and elite attempts to invent tradition, such as that undertaken by states and colonial authorities. And it often focuses on the themes of nation building, war, and genocide. But much less attention has been paid to dissident forms of commemoration in English political culture, largely, I think, because commemoration has often been dismissed by those of us on the political left as a technique of rule used by elites. But as the Chartists themselves bear eloquent testimony, remembrance has been no less central to left-wing political movements. With the rise of what has been termed critical heritage studies, historians are now better placed to interrogate the form and content of these dissident commemorations. Critical heritage studies rejects the conventional view, in case you're wondering, that heritage is constituted by the inherent values of objects and practices. Rather, it views heritage as the product of judgments made not by elites, but by the public. Heritage from below, if you like, about what is valuable from the past. The heterogeneous ways in which knowledge of Chartism is produced and consumed, not just through text-based histories, but also through oral tradition, pageants, public lectures, radio and television, ephemera, and most recently graphic novels, all of which I will touch on in today's talk. I think all of that together belies the existence of some equivalent authorized heritage discourse. That is to say, there is no single way of remembering and invoking the Chartists. But issues of ownership and power hierarchies cannot be ignored due to the role played by those who have variously seen themselves as curators and custodians. As the Irish historian Guy Biner has argued, quote, even democratic history, such as that undertaken by the political left to construct a people's history, is by no means egalitarian. It has its own hierarchies and multi-layered power structures. Now, the quotation in my talk today, it would be a mistake, I think, to assume that Chartism has always been, quote, ever present to the progressive mind, in the words of the Durham Miners leader and Lib Lab MP John Wilson, who said that in 1910. Like most things, the memory of Chartism has ebbed and flowed, even for the political left, for whom commemoration and heritage has, according to Patrick Wright, often collapsed into a disabling conservative nostalgia. But recent work has begun to highlight the central role played by the invention of tradition and memory in modern British politics. But I think the persistence of a radical tradition beyond 1918 has attracted much less attention. And that which exists has focused on particular episodes, such as the Tolpuddle martyrs in the interwar Labour Party, or the role of heritage in contemporary British politics, to cite two examples. So little has been written on Chartism after 1918. And if you're wondering what the significance of that date is, I think two things. After 1918, the memory of Chartism ceases to be a living one. There are reports in the newspapers in the 1920s of obituaries of generally left-wing political activists who claim to have remembered Chartism. So people who've directly got that connection, that transgenerational connection to Chartism, if you like, they're dying out by the 1920s. The other significance, of course, of 1918 is that this is when the cardinal point of the People's Charter is finally conceded universal manhood suffrage, the most important of the 6 points of the People's Charter. Now, in the longer version of this, I focus on three key episodes in the memory of Chartism. The first is the battle within the interwar political left for control of the movement's memory. The second is the attempt by the political and cultural establishment to co-opt Chartism since the 1980s, which I have to say has been an absolute revelation. It's made me both angry and kind of bemused at the same time. I'll give you a couple of examples with these kind of images that I've got here. The Fabian view, if you're wondering who they are, of course, it starts with William Lovett. Then we've got Mark Hovell and G.D.H. Cole endearingly smoking a cigarette, which kind of contradicts my image of Cole as quite a puritanical academic, and culminating in New Labour. The militant proletarian view, Ernest Jones, Harry Pollitt, The Morning Star, most recently a very good book by Rob Saul that looks at, that really in some ways is the culmination, I think, of this militant proletarian view. It's also been put across a lot in the writings of Keith Flett, who I think has done more than most to keep memories of Chartism as an independent, class-conscious, internationalist movement alive. And I had the pleasure of reading a lot of Keith's letters to The Guardian and other places in the 1980s, where he basically has a go at mainstream Labour for trying to appropriate Chartism as their own. And there's a wonderful example where he focuses on Neil Kinnock's visit to Newport in the early 1980s, where Kinnock almost sort of gate crashes a annual commemoration of the Newport uprising, that militant physical force Chartism in Wales in 1839, and he lays a red rose on the graves of some of the Chartists and their descendants, claiming that the Chartists had always laid red roses on the graves of those who had lost their lives, which is not true. It's a complete invention of tradition. There are reports, as some of you will know more than me, of Chartists laying flowers on the graves annually, but there's no record, as far as I can tell, that they were red roses. So it just shows you, as an example there of the way in which mainstream Labour at that time was trying to appropriate Chartism. And Keith contests that violently in an article in The Guardian. So there's the kind of that view. The Chartists as premature Liberal Democrats, if you're wondering where that view comes from, this was a claim that Dorothy Thompson made, probably the most eminent historian of Chartism the last 50 or 60 years, along with Malcolm Chase, who I'll talk about later. In one of her last public talks, she noted disturbingly that in more recent years, Chartism had started to be appropriated by the political right. And she noted that it was a conservative education minister who'd put Chartism on the national curriculum, not a Labour one. And I started to find other examples of this. There was even a question on the Chartists on the Eton entrance exam, which was a slightly condescending question. I forget what it was. Why was Chartism popular, and who cared? Not quite that, but it was almost that. And yeah, it was that kind of view that, let's airbrush out of the fact that Chartists, some of them at least, took up arms against the state. Let's see them as dull but worthy reformers. And I think that is important to distinguish between the Fabian view. Some of you might be thinking, well, how is this different from the Fabian view? I think that the premature Liberal Democrats view is more insidious, and is not really connected to what I would see as a genuine left-wing politics. You've got Michael Gove, and I'll now tell you why he's appearing over my shoulder. They're in debates about electoral reform in the run-up to the 2010 general election and afterwards. Gove and a number of other Tories claimed that in demanding equal-sized constituencies, that they were trying to implement one of the other points of the People's Charter, that we now are also descendants from the Chartists. So yeah, you can see that it has become, I think, in some ways, a bit of a political football. And whilst it has been central to the political left, it's been used as a way of marking out divisions within and between left-wing movements. You can see with Gove here over my shoulder, it is not the exclusive preserve of the political left, even though they are the ones, of course, who've said most about it. So yeah, just some kind of broader examples before, good, Gove's gone now. Some examples of what I'm talking about and the broader questions I'm raising. Who owns Chartism? Why do they invoke it? Yeah, I forgot. I realised I forgot to mention the National Trust one here, and I don't mean to do down the fact that the National Trust finally bought a former Chartist cottage and opened it to the public in the 1990s, I think, or was it more recent than that? But again, if you have a look at the website and the accompanying material that surrounds this, you would not get the impression that this is some kind of testament to a militant, proletarian, potentially violent, internationalist working class movement. This is Chartists as grow your owners, organic, self-sustainable, the good life. It very much, that's what the National Trust, without getting too political, has done to Chartism. It's turned it into this destination of tourism, and Richard Bryars and Penelope Keith, etc. People disagree with that. I'm happy to debate that. But yeah, the theme that I did want to focus mostly on in my talk, I'm starting to ramble now. I said to you that there were three parts to it. The first was how the interwar political left appropriated Chartism. Haven't got time to go into that today. The second, I've just given you a little flavour of the way in which Chartism is being co-opted by the political and cultural establishment. And I'm happy to talk more about those two episodes. But my main focus today is a much more, to my mind, optimistic and vibrant way in which Chartism has been invoked. And that is in the contemporary and ongoing campaigns for democratic renewal promoted by a range of heritage organisations and groups, not the National Trust. So it's that sort of case study that I want to turn to. And these are just some of the other examples of those three tendencies that I've mentioned. Yeah, so now we come to, I will get to what I've just said, but my slides are getting ahead of me. What you've got here are two examples of the way in which the centenary of Chartism was commemorated in 1939. One, a communist rally where a pageant was put on with the involvement of the Communist Party historian group, with Donna Tor acting as the historical advisor. That is well known, but the source that I managed to find on eBay was a program from the Potteries in 1939, which I haven't been able to find anywhere else. Actually, I've just realised now I'm showing you both of the London ones. So I promised to show you a source, and I haven't actually put it in my PowerPoint, but I can do. I'll show it you afterwards. But basically, I managed to find a provincial example of the way in which Chartism was being commemorated in 1939, and in a way that was different from the London one, which is very much the preserve of the Communist Party. The one in the Potteries brought, or tried to bring together, all of the wings of the Labour movement. And it was very much presented as, during this time of our battle against fascism, it's important that we come together and remember what unites us rather than what divides us. And then it has a wonderful bit where it says, whilst the campaign against fascism is important, we mustn't lose sight of the problems of capitalism, and we must continue in the tradition of the Chartists to fight the inequalities that result from capitalism. So the one in the Potteries, the program that I managed to find on eBay for this event, that wasn't a pageant as such. It was more of a demonstration of which memories of Chartism were invoked as a way of trying to bring together the political left, very much in the spirit of the Popular Front, as you'd imagine, in the interwar period and just afterwards. Now, come finally to what I'm meant to be talking about, which is the role of Chartism in contemporary campaigns for democratic renewal. And I'm going to start negative again before I get positive. Just let me find the relevant section. Yeah. At first glance, and despite, brackets, possibly because of, the appropriation of Chartism by the establishment and the wresting of the memory of the movement from the political left, it would not be difficult to construct a narrative of decline in terms of the public's awareness of Chartism, at least critical awareness. For example, and this is the one that you can see an image of on my slides, one of the casualties of the relentless tabloidization of British newspapers has been reviews of serious academic scholarship. As late as the 1980s, it was not uncommon to find reviews of academic studies of Chartism in The Guardian and Observer. And there's an example from Gwyn Williams here on the PowerPoint. In the interwar and early post-war years, The Guardian had not been alone, as even the local and regional press had featured reviews of, for example, Asa Briggs's landmark edited volume, Chartist Studies. Perhaps even more surprising is that some of these reviews were written by academics themselves and occasionally political figures. Now, there's no denying that this attempt to engage the public with academic studies has declined, even in more serious titles such as the London Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. These are, you'd be hard pressed to find reviews of Chartism these days, or of increasingly, I think, of academic books. They're increasingly filled with reviews of books likely to be picked up from high street bookshops and similar online stories, or worse still, diary entries by self-important academics and other literati on what has moved them recently. Now, as is so often the case, I think there seems little point blaming the media for this decline, as they're reflecting broader shifts in public opinion and taste. Academic publishing itself bears some of the responsibility for this decline due to the high prices attached to hardback volumes. Taxes on knowledge is what the Chartists would have called it. And I would include my own book in this, which was published by Routledge last year for £120. Fortunately, the paperback edition is coming out next month for the still relatively princely sum of £36, but you take the point I'm making here. And it is worth mentioning here that there are some publishers who have done sterling work in trying to keep memories of Chartism alive and making academic studies of Chartism accessible to popular audiences. Merlin Press has run a very long now and successful series of Chartist studies edited by Owen Ashton, and more recently Breviary Stuff has started to reissue very expensive and often out of date academic titles. So it's not all bad. There are some positives. Yeah. Ironically, as Chartism and its academic historians have become an accepted part of the profession in ways that was not the case before the advent of history from below, the fruits of historical research, apart from the sterling efforts of Merlin and Breviary, have become less accessible, a problem that has only begun to be addressed by the moves to open access and impact activities around the research assessment exercise for those in academia who know about that. Don't worry if you don't. This is not just because of pricing research out of the market, but also academic specialisation. And in the heated debates over postmodernism, in which Chartism was front and centre, the historiography became foreboding. It was for this reason why Malcolm Chase declined to engage explicitly in historical debates in Chartism and new history. And I'm going to read to you an email exchange that I had with Malcolm, who sadly died last year, almost a year ago. It was on the 29th of February. And yeah, Malcolm was hugely supportive of myself and many others, and will be doing a much better job at this paper than I am were he here with us today, but sadly he's not. Malcolm said, when we were talking, I was congratulating him on his new book. He said, "I wanted to produce a narrative thickened by analysis, but not cluttered by theory and abstraction, which, in my judgment, alienate many readers. The old adult educator in me wants everything I write to be accessible to the interested general reader." End quotation. I think Malcolm's reference there to adult education is telling. It's a reminder that it's not just the recent requirements around the research excellence framework that I mentioned to do with impact and public engagement, which has led to collaboration between academics and interested members of the public. There is now a long, not venerable, tradition of public engagement by historians of Chartism, which was always a central goal of history from below from the 1950s and 60s, and before that through agencies such as the WEA and the Left Book Club. In the interwar and early post-1945 years, it's true that the relationship between academics and members of the public was more of a top-down hierarchical relationship of historians and their publics. But with the rise of history from below in the 50s and 60s, that relationship became less hierarchical and more collaborative. The indebtedness of E.P. Thompson, for example, to those in his adult education classes is well known. The unpublished joint article that E.P. Thompson and Dorothy Thompson wrote on Halifax as a Chartist centre also emerged out of their working in adult education and engaging in political activism, where they encountered some of the memories of Chartism still alive in the West Riding. As late as 1930, there were still political activists in the West Riding who could cite by memory Chartist speeches. Although the Thompsons were exemplars of this sort of collaboration, they were not alone. One thinks of JFC Harrison, David Goodway, both historians of Chartism, and for much of his career, Malcolm Chase, as we've just seen. Unfortunately, adult education has declined significantly over the last 2 decades, especially in the arts and humanities, as the closure or the streamlining of lifelong learning departments in universities sadly testifies, which has led, I think, in some ways to a corresponding decline of labour history. And yet, here comes the good news. Notwithstanding these indicators of decline in the posthumous life of Chartism, in the last 2 decades, we've seen the growth of a vibrant heritage from below, which has renewed the memory of Chartism, taking it in new directions and to new audiences. This heritage from below has deep roots. One wellspring has been drama, theatre and literature. Community theatre has been particularly influential. And this is an instance, I think, of how radical playwrights and other cultural producers have tried to reach working class audiences. Since the interwar years, a series of plays have been staged, often in former Chartist strongholds, such as Bradford, South Wales, and Manchester. Got an image for you. Yeah, here you can see a play put on at the Manchester University settlement about the life of Dr. Schofield, a Manchester Chartist. And there was particular interest around Schofield, which continued actually until the late 20th century. And memories of him were kept sort of alive in the early 80s when there was an unsuccessful attempt to preserve his chapel in Ancoats in the early 80s, which was sadly demolished. Chapel was at the centre of not just Schofield's life as a religious minister, but also as a school, a democratic school of Chartism in some respects, where he was a revered figure in the local movement. And of course, Schofield himself plays a part in the Chartists creating their own cultures of remembrance, because it was in the grounds of his chapel in Ancoats where there was a monument to the memory of Henry Hunt, sort of previous generation of radicals that Chartists identified with. So I think plays, theatre have been important, intangible cultural heritage, if you like. These plays have tried to tell the story of how their communities participated in Chartism, often centering around local leaders such as Peter Bussey in Bradford, or Fat Pete, as he was known as, and Dr. Schofield in Manchester, or a sort of key episode such as a rising. Sniffy reviews by theatre critics, of course, sometimes missed this key objective. Indeed, beyond party political invoking, one of the key ways in which memory of Chartism was kept alive for much of the century was through stage and page, and more recently song and poetry, of which Mike Sanders, who I think is here, knows a lot more about and has done more than most to promote that kind of interaction and awareness. Yeah. Those of you from Wales and possibly beyond will be aware of this example. The series of novels by Alexander Cordell, in particular Rape of the Fair Country, 1959, which focused on the Newport Rising, rekindled the memory of Chartism for a new post-war generation. The value, as well as the attendant human interest of Cordell's novels, was that it told the history of Chartism through the lives of individuals, which brought an immediacy and empathy often lacking in academic and party political commemoration of Chartism. Bursting with vitality, zest and gusto was J.B. Priestley's judgment of Rape of the Fair Country. In South Wales especially, the popularity of Cordell's novels led to discussions in the press about the historical veracity of his depiction of Chartism. Cordell even published a review of Asa Briggs's Chartist studies, while historians such as Gwyn Williams reflected on the value of historical fiction. Some of this heritage from below also traces its origins to the political left's invoking of Chartism. And this political tradition lives on, though on the whole, as I said at the start, it's far less party political than was the case in the interwar and post-war years. As early as the 1970s and early 80s, this trend was discernible in some of the moves by the New Left and local socialisms to weld together class and identity politics to engage new community groups. Let me give you an example from my own city. When a group of Sheffield trade unionists and political activists established the Holbury Society for the study of Sheffield labour history after the Sheffield Chartist Samuel Holbury, who had led an uprising in the town in January 1840, that society unequivocally declared that it was, quote, a socialist but politically non-sectarian organisation. Give you a picture of Holbury. The survival of this bust actually is testament to the afterlife of Chartism itself. It is now in, it does now belong to Sheffield museums, but I think for many years it was literally kept under a Sheffield cutler's place of work on his machine, and it looked rather battered, but the council kind of restored it. And I think the fact that someone like Holbury is now on display in a civic museum, kind of, I mean, you can read that in two ways. On the one hand, you've got characters like Holbury, and I think that the statue to Dr. Price in Wales would be an example of this, of Chartists drowning in seas of civic worthiness, which strip them of that kind of more militant proletarian consciousness that exists. And part of me likes the more kind of the battered version of Holbury's statue before it was restored, because it reflected more poignantly, I think, the violent history of the working class, of which Holbury himself was an exemplar, having led a Chartist uprising in 1840. And yet here he is, nicely polished, looking, if you didn't know, like a almost, but not quite, a Greek hero. The hair's obviously slightly different. Anyway, back to optimism. I'm getting negative again. Yeah. While recovering and celebrating the vibrant tradition of working class protest in the, quote, People's Republic of South Yorkshire, the Holbury Society mirrored the wider New Left's attempt to graft on identity politics to its more traditional and enduring emphasis on working class protest. For example, the Society worked with both the women's and peace movements and cooperated with an independent women's history group. But by the 1990s and early 2000s, the days of identifying Chartism as the exclusive preserve of an avowedly socialist left were fading, though the tradition lives on in some places, like the Socialist History Society. The theme of democratic renewal and citizenship is now more prominent. Take the organisation Our Chartist Heritage, which has taken the lead on the commemoration of the Newport Rising of 1839. What I say, I now say with trepidation, because there is a member of the committee here with us. I've seen that Les James is with us, but don't worry, Les, it's all positive. I haven't got anything negative to say about this. The theme, yeah, so take this organisation as an example, which has led on the commemoration of the Newport Rising. Its primary objective is, quote, to inspire today's citizens with a passion for justice and truth, which roused yesterday's Chartist and suffragette reformers. Through a rich programme of talks, exhibitions, educational materials, Our Chartist Heritage is avowedly an example of heritage from below. And I give you a longer quotation, which I think aptly summarises this theme of what's going on here. Quote, we recognise that heritage is about people, not just about places or things. A better understanding of local Chartist heritage will benefit the community living in the Newport region by enhancing the positive perception of the authentic Chartist heritage of the area, encouraging a sense of civic pride and shared ownership. End quote. So democratic renewal, civic pride, and reaching out to the marginalised is central to the goals of our Chartist heritage. While this organisation has certainly included academics and specialists in its programme of events, including myself, mainly through talks at the annual Chartist convention, I couldn't help thinking that the relationship between academics and heritage groups like our Chartist heritage is not unlike that between the London Working Men's Association and gentlemen radical leaders in the 1830s, though I make no claims to be gentlemanly. Involvement by academics, brackets, gentlemen leaders, is encouraged and welcomed, solicited even, but it is, as it should be, on the terms of the heritage groups themselves, just as it should be in remembering a democratic movement like Chartism. This democratization of heritage practice, as it has been termed, also underpins other forms of posthumous Chartism, such as the website Chartist Ancestors, run by Mark Crail. Mark's website contains a wealth of material on Chartism, and it has similar objectives and relationships with academics, as did the community celebrations of the Chartist demonstrations on Kennington Common in 1848, which I've also played a small part in, which is what's referenced here on the left. These groups are extremely mindful of the dangers of heritage distorting the past. For example, historians were consulted in the research for the Kennington project that I mentioned. They gave talks and participated in a number of workshops. In all these Heritage from Below initiatives, the emphasis is on Chartism as our story, to cite the subtitle of the Kennington project, which reinforces the view not just of heritage belonging to the people, but people as active producers and consumers of heritage. The interactive nature of these examples of commemoration also turn participants from being passive to active producers of heritage. A favourite device has been to ask contemporary audiences to come up with a new people's charter, while another has been Chartist walks in which present urban geography is inscribed with new historical meaning by telling the story of Chartism through familiar places. The importance of place and a sense of community is essential for meaningful heritage. As the co-founder of the Kennington Chartist project commented, Richard Galpin, quote, "We found that Kennington 1848 is a story that people really connect with. A lot of people were amazed to hear that this happened in their local park. Several participants responded that they were proud that Kennington had played a part in the birth of democracy." For those of you who don't know Chartism, Kennington Common is the site of probably the single most famous Chartist meeting that took place in 1848, just before the presentation of the third Chartist petition to Parliament. The emphasis on place also spoke to contemporary concerns in London about the increasing pressure on public spaces and cuts to funding of local parks. And it's not just the connection between people and place, past and present, that reinforces this sense of ownership of the memory of Chartism, but also the open-ended nature of the radical tradition itself. And this was something that the Chartists themselves were acutely aware of standing on the shoulders of earlier radical reformers. That was the subject of my book. I want to finish with one final brief example before I conclude. Each of these facets that I've mentioned is weaved into one of the most contemporary forms of commemorating the Chartists, and that is a graphic novel on the Newport Rising by Josh Cranton, Rhys D.W. and David Daniel. And hopefully you can see on the screen, this is what this is here. And I'm just going to move forward a slide, so you probably can't quite read the writing, but I'm going to read the important bits. Appropriately styled as, quote, a retelling of our history and their story, which I think is a wonderful way of thinking about heritage from below, our history and their story. The graphic novel unashamedly begins with the confession that, quote, this is not a historical account, but a Gothic reimagining of the Rising, which is set in an alternate modern-day universe in which the original Rising did not take place, leaving modern-day characters to fight for their freedom. The graphic novel arose from a perception that the way in which Chartism had been commemorated in South Wales had, in the view of the authors, been done in ways that made it hard for the younger generation to connect with the history of the movement. This theme of discontent had been highlighted a few years earlier in the poignant BBC documentary on political disengagement in South Wales by the Welsh actor Michael Sheen, which began with the Newport Rising of 1839. Sheen explored why, with this rich democratic heritage and Chartist bequest, ordinary people in the valleys were turning away from politics. Sheen called for a new style Chartist movement to make politics more representative and accountable, citing groups such as the United Valleys Action Group, which, in bringing together disparate groups to campaign for change, Sheen argued was very much in the tradition of the Chartists themselves. Like Sheen, the authors of the graphic novel were also conscious of the rising apathy amongst young people in South Wales, and their hope was that a retelling of Chartism as leather-clad punks would make the Chartists more relatable. Once again, this was Chartism as memory rather than as history, while the latter posits a fundamental separation between past and present, privileges objectivity, factual accuracy. Memory, by contrast, is based on continuity between past and present, and is more dynamic, inclusive, and serves the needs of the present far more so than history. What each of these recent examples of Chartist commemoration suggest is that heritage is most effective and meaningful when people take matters into their own hands, and what could be more in the tradition of the Chartists. In 2020, this reached new heights and began to assume the form of iconoclasm with the toppling of the statue of the Bristol slaver Edward Colston. At first glance, this appears to have no relationship with the memory of Chartism, until, that is, we recall the long-running campaign to erect a memorial to the Black London Chartist leader, William Cuffay. Despite the promptings of a range of individuals and groups, from Keith Flett, most recently Tom Scriven, through to Black Lives Matter, the campaign appears to be no closer to realising this objective. I hope I'm wrong, but that was my sense, that we're not any closer to getting a statue to this important London Chartist. But the continued absence of memorials to outstanding Black Britons such as Cuffay and many others means that instances of what the historian Alan Rice has termed guerrilla memorialisation, of people taking direct action themselves, as they did with the Colston statue, are likely to proliferate, while ever the civic landscape excludes those like Cuffay. Cuffay has even entered the hallowed ground of Westminster, when Malcolm Chase made sure that his presence was there when he curated an exhibition on Chartism in 2013, I think. But if white working class Londoners had no problem, as far as we know, with a black man as their leader, surely it is time that present day Londoners erect a lasting memorial to this remarkable Chartist. The fact that Cuffay was also disabled, he had deformities in his spine and shins, as well as working class, is suggestive of the ways that historic Black Britons can also be polysemic and used in ways to give voice to different constituencies and concerns in the present, in ways that celebrate a shared multiracial British history. By reinserting figures like Cuffay into British history, this will help to correct the perfectly understandable perception that the history of radical movements like Chartism were the exclusive preserve of a white working class. While ever the perception remains that groups like the Chartists were dull but worthy white working class reformers, then historians cannot complain that school children are increasingly taught the history of liberal democracy through the Black civil rights movement in the USA, which is understandably seen in the way it's presented as more relevant and relatable to a multicultural Britain. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, actually. I could read my long conclusion, but I'm not going to do, because I want to leave some of this hanging, and hopefully it will prompt kind of questions and rebuttals and disagreements, which is fine.
Great, yes.
And I'm out of time, so.
but we certainly look forward to others' contributions, and it's always nice to see links which exist or become apparent between different talks. We've had a talk not long ago on a new graphic novel about Thomas Paine, which is now the subject of a crowdfunder. Folks, remember that it's got a fortnight to go, still time to get in there.
Yeah.
And we've also had for Black History Month last October, somebody talking to us about the possibility of a statue of Len Johnson, black boxer and communist activist in Manchester. So links wherever you look, and we do have one question in the chat and one observation. I'm going to be opening it up further, but I'll start with Andrew Bibby's observation, which is that he sat in a few years ago on a National Trust Open Day at Great Dodford, the Chartist settlement, where they have one of the remaining cottages. The open day was facilitated by local activist volunteers who were very clear about the political significance of Chartism. So perhaps he suggests your comments about the National Trust may need some finessing.
Yeah,
and he also
absolutely.
says it's worth going to Great Dodford.
Yeah. To be fair, I was mainly going there on the promotional material that the National Trust has on its website, which, I take that point. I think, I do need to nuance that. Agreed.
Well, that was easy. Well done, Andrew. Okay, and we have here a question from last week's speaker. Very nice to have people coming back again. That's great. So last week's Matthew has a question for this week's Matthew. Have you found any evidence of support for annual parliaments, the final unachieved objective of the Chartists, in the interwar Labour Party? What about triennial parliaments?
Not in the interwar Labour Parliament. One of the points that I didn't have time to fully develop in the paper was how New Labour had mangled the memory of Chartism. And there's a wonderful quote where they're debating electoral reform in the early 2000s, I think, where some New Labour MP stands up and says, we've moved on a lot since the Chartists and not all of their ideas were right. We certainly wouldn't want annual parliaments, would we? And I thought that was really telling of a kind of New Labour condescension towards kind of what Chartism represented, really. Of course, that was the only point of the 6 points that's not been achieved. Annual parliaments, general elections every year, for the obvious reason that I don't think any MP would ever vote for that, because it stops you from turning inwards for 5 years or 7 years. And the mantra there of the Chartists, of course, was short terms make for long friends. This idea that if you have to put yourself up for election regularly, as some of them did it informally, like John Fielden, close to where most of you guys are coming from, as MP for Oldham, but most of them didn't do that. But no, I haven't seen anything in the interwar Labour movement specifically about that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of invoking of Chartists by the interwar Labour movement. And this is where the sort of putting Ernest Jones, the last big Chartist leader, this is where he gets put on quite a big pedestal. And it comes from all directions. The Communist Party like him because he was friends with Marx and Engels. The Independent Labour Party like him, and because he's, to some extent, as does some of the mainstream Labour, because he's in that tradition of gentleman reformers. For me, it was a real eye-opener that, if you read a lot of the professional historiography on Jones, this man was awful. He had no kind of fixed opinions. He was a shyster. But if you push that too far, you kind of forget what it was that made these figures popular. And I realized by looking at the memory of Jones in the interwar years and beyond, you kind of got much closer to understanding the popularity of him, which you wouldn't get from reading academic historians. I think sometimes we're too cynical as historians that we can't help putting a pin, bursting historical reputations and things, and that's fine. That is part of what we should do. But there's a debate to be had there about which view of Jones is the most accurate, the remembered one or the one of professional historians. And I think between those two poles, there should be some common ground.
Thanks. And you're right, Mike Sanders is here, good friend to the library. Hi, Mike. And he says, does Chartism's regional strength create problems in terms of constructing its national profile?
Yeah, so there's a lovely example of the BBC putting on a radio program in the 1930s, I think, where almost as a kind of afterthought, they go, "Ooh, wouldn't it be great if we allowed different regions to sort of tell us a little bit about the Chartists in their places, their own places. And to be fair, they did put a program on that gave voice to the different regions to complicate that national narrative that Mike mentions there. But it was done in quite, as you'd expect, at that time, condescending BBC Metropolitan. Let's just give a bit of voice to the provincials. The Daily Worker was incandescent with rage about this BBC programme, partly because they're contesting that Fabian view, and it should be pointed out that Fabian view was given a lot of airtime because GDH Cole in the interwar years and early post-war years was the go-to historical consultant, lecturer, speaker to talk about the Chartists. So you can kind of understand where some of that Communist Party annoyance is coming from, this very sort of gradualist, airbrushed view of Chartism is being presented on the airwaves. But no, I wouldn't say national issues of local peculiarities, of particularism, has been a dominant way in which Chartism is remembered. It's turned more on, were the Chartists class conscious, militant, internationalist, proletarian, all of those things, rather than did Chartism mean something different in Manchester than it did in London? I would say.
A comment from Lydia who said, we'll never have thought about history workshop activity in Bradford if I hadn't seen the Red Ladder Theatre plays.
No.
And I've got a question from Sue. Do you think the First World War acts as an influence towards Chartism being put to one side, or do you think it contributed to Chartism being more valued?
I think it contributed to Chartism being more valued because I think partly the granting of universal manhood suffrage in 1918 makes people a bit more conscious of where that fight began. And also, I mentioned Ernest Jones. It's the centenary of his birth in 1919. And it is that occasion that prompts, in particular, the ILP and Hindman at that stage to promote a series of articles in their newspapers and memories of him from people who remember. There were just about some people, as I said at the start, who remembered him. So no, I think really, if anything, memory of Chartism had sort of declined a bit in the Edwardian years, despite that phrase ever present to the progressive mind. And yeah, my colleague Tony Taylor has written a lot more on this, has looked at how Chartists in the mid-Victorian, late Victorian years, they kind of started to play down their Chartism as a way of facilitating their what would be the word? Transformation into Gladstonian liberals. So there's a definite attempt to play down Chartism by some liberal activists. I mean, for others, they deliberately emphasised their Chartism as a way of distancing themselves from the Liberal Party of Mr. Gladstone, just as I said that the far left is doing something similar in the interwar period to distance itself from mainstream Labour. But I think because this movement is so diverse that, almost it doesn't matter where you are on the left, you will find something in Chartism to validate, to identify with, to invoke for a particular reason.
That ties in very nicely with the next question. How much do you think the current Labour left and groups like Momentum embrace the history, memory and ideals of Chartism?
Yeah, I haven't found any Momentum discussion of Chartism, though I have to confess I haven't gone out and looked for it. Not to say that it's not there. Yeah, I don't want to get too reveal my politics too much. But yeah, I mean, Corbyn, gentleman radical, he's in some respects, he's in that tradition, isn't he? Keir Starmer in a different sort of way, also gentleman radical. Yeah, that kind of tradition lives on more powerfully, I think, than the militant proletarian class conscious view does. I should say that one of the reasons why the Fabian view almost triumphed unequivocally by the 1990s is because that view of Chartism as militant, proletarian, internationalist, all these things I keep reading off, that was done to death, not just by New Labour, but by a generation of academic historians who were defining themselves against Marxism with the rise of postmodernism. And almost two things came together, a perfect storm of revisionism in academia and a New Labour, all of which wanted to sanitize Chartism, to make it, as Dorothy Thompson said, into these premature liberal Democrats. And that was nearly lost. And that's why I think in the written piece, and I don't know if I did it enough here, but I really wanted to give people like Keith Slett, who I mentioned, a voice, because they were doing an awful lot beyond academia. I mean, Keith's one of those unusual people he's both an academic and also a very committed political activist. But, they were doing a lot to kind of keep that older view, the more class-conscious view of Chartism alive. As I think some of the heritage organisations are doing in a less explicit way. Yeah.
And Keith, a previous speaker in the Visible History series, some time ago now, when we were back in the annex of long lost memory. So next one now, here's a big one, and it's sort of going back to basics. Why do you think the demands of the Chartists were conceded? Was it fear of revolution?
Yeah, it's often said that Chartism failed. And I'm going to quote Malcolm Chase again here. Chartism was a movement of small victories. No, it didn't, of course, get the People's Charter enacted during its time as a mass movement, but it did nonetheless force the political establishment to reassess the way that it governed. Things like the Corn Law. We all at school, we're taught the Anti-Corn Law League brings about, the repeal of the Corn Laws. It's really the Chartists, of course, who bring about those far-reaching reforms and factory reform because of the pressure, because of the fear that they create. Because of what mass political action does, but in a characteristically British way, of course. The establishment can't be seen to be responding directly to the grievances of the Chartists, and it does it under its own steam, or claims to do it under its own steam when it wants to, like repealing the Corn Laws, or eventually 20 years after Chartism, enacting the Second Reform Act, and then later the Third. But yeah, so in the end, the reason why they're implemented is, I think, because, and this is where I do reveal myself as a more kind of William Lovett type Chartist than a Fergus O'Connor or Ernest Jones one, as much as I admire them, is that people like Lovett had done so much to try and convince the upper classes that the working classes were fit for citizenship. To be fair, even O'Connor had done that in some ways. But yeah, that's partly why they've made democracy safe for the political establishment. Does that make them class collaborators? I don't think so. One of the charges levelled against the Fabians, William Lovett and such like, Lovett would never have accepted anything less than universal manhood suffrage. So he's not a collaborator, a compromiser in that respect. But he doesn't shout about it, or he's not as violent as he claims in his autobiography. Lovett himself sanitizes his earlier career when he writes his autobiography. Who, of course, he lives to the wonderful age of 76, so he's able to spend the last years of his life writing this autobiography. And he presents, again, he Fabianizes himself far more so than he actually was during the 1830s. There are spy reports of Lovett in the early 1830s being described as a dangerous man. So yeah, people sanitize themselves, and they're also sanitized by others, if that kind of makes sense.
The concept of Fabianizing is going to stay with me, Matt. Thank you. One from one of our regulars, Stuart, up in the northeast, is part of the issue of how Chartism is remembered, but it had a wide spread of views within it. And is this why some leaders moved from militancy to liberalism? One example is Robert Lowry in North Shields, who seems to have supported armed rebellion at one time, but soon moved away from politics to the temperance movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And we forget this sometimes on the political left because it's a little bit uncomfortable. But some former Chartists became Tories. They became supporters of the Benjamin Disraeli's Tory party, and saw no contradiction in reconciling their earlier radicalism and Chartism with support for for Toryism. We, of course, as historians, and particularly those with left-wing credentials, have trouble with reconciling that. But two of the biggest Chartists, who never called themselves Chartists, were the Tories, Richard Osler and Joseph Rayner Stevens, again, just down the road from you guys in Manchester, Ashton-under-Lyne. So there's no, again, this is something I try and write about in the book, but Stevens and Osler are Chartists in all but name. They might not call themselves that, but what they say is very Chartist. The way that they're appropriated by their followers and loved and adored makes them symbolically Chartists. And yeah, that does go back to that point of Chartism being, it's a very diverse bag, isn't it? And it does contain a lot, like all left-wing political, like all political movements. It contains diversity of opinion, some of which are syncretic, compatible, anticipatory of even Toryism. And you can see the point that the Tories have shown themselves much more willing to introduce social reform than the Whigs and the Liberals, with that kind of tradition of paternalistic Toryism that people like Osler and Stevens tap into, and then the next generation do as well. So yeah, I have no kind of problems in people say, oh, how is it Lancashire became a hotbed of sort of Toryism in many parts in the late Victorian and Edwardian years? And it makes much more sense when you realise just how close radicalism and Toryism had been in some respects in the early 19th century.
We've got not only last week's speaker, but next week's speaker with us as well. It's Ali Ronan. I'm going to jump her question up the queue. I'm not a Chartist historian, she says, but where are the women who didn't all get the vote in 1918?
I'm going to mention Malcolm again. One of the things he made sure was that when that exhibition on Chartism was put on in the House of Commons, he insisted quite rightly that it made reference to the fact that the Chartists also began a discussion. It was nothing more than that. They began a discussion about whether women should be given the vote as well. And William Lovett, who I keep mentioning, was probably one of the more sympathetic male Chartists to the idea of votes for women. So although it doesn't get coded in the People's Charter in the end, and the reason for that is it's claimed partly as a reason of practicality. We'll get laughed out of the room if we're asking for votes for working class women as well as men, that kind of argument. But, you know, there is also some kind of sentimental domesticity in Chartism. There's also some misogyny. A lot of working class male workers feel threatened in the workplace because of cheap female labour, and they want them back in the home, partly for reasons of protection. I think we forget that sometimes. It's easy to reread that kind of sentimental domesticity through early 21st century kind of feminism and go, how awful was this that they're trying to banish women back into the home? But you've got to remember in part how awful the conditions were in some of the factories where women are working at this time. So it does come in some respects from a good place of trying to protect working class women, but it also comes from a bad place as well. I have an article coming out next year, actually, in English Historical Review, which looks at women and Chartism. And in particular, it looks at women and Chartism in the 1850s, where, again, plug for my hometown, a group of Sheffield working class women send the first ever petition to Parliament for votes for women. And it's a group, the Women's Rights Association, about which we need to know a lot more, especially in the city. And I am trying to think of ways of raising the kind of public awareness and profile of these women. And my argument is that it's not a coincidence it comes out of the Chartist movement, because by the time they become active in the late 40s, early 50s, there's 10 years of female Chartism in Sheffield, where women have formed their own organisations within Chartism. Yes, sometimes they've claimed to be doing that to support their menfolk, but other times they do start to edge towards the idea of rights for themselves. So the WRA, for me, the Women's Rights Association, represents the culmination of a feminist current within Chartism.
Okay, thank you. Robert, what lessons, positive or negative, do you think the recent bicentenary of Peterloo has for the imminent bicentenary of Chartism, and he's giving a hint to those of us in the Manchester area, I believe.
Yeah, I think I wasn't directly involved in Commemoration of Peterloo, but yeah, I mean, there's nothing better than getting a relatively blockbustered film out. But what I liked about the Peterloo festivities was that it operated on several levels. Yes, there was the kind of film you could go and watch if you want the box office experience, but there was also the more sort of community activism, heritage from below, that I was also talking about. And my sense is that, you know, if you were someone who, interested member of the public, who engaged with the Commemoration of Peterloo on all of these levels, watching Mike Lee's film, perhaps attending some talks by local community history groups, whatever, is that I think you probably would come away with a more fractured and diverse, and in some respects contradictory, view about what Peterloo represented. And to my mind, if people come away from talks with that sort of confusion and something's not quite marrying here, that's better than providing a simple, straightforward, you know, premature Liberal Democrats kind of line. So yeah, I like the fact that it was polysemic, it was polyvocal. And I suspect, though I don't know, I suspect that those who were involved in more community-based heritage from below commemorations of Peterloo probably felt that their voice wasn't heard as loudly as it ought to have been. Because as soon as civic authorities get hold of history, you know, as I said in my paper, you do get this, like the kind of statue to Richard Price in Llantrisant in Wales. I mean, they do start to drown in seas of civic worthiness. Price is remembered in that statue and the discussion that took place around it when it was erected in the 1980s. His Chartism and his role in the Newport Rising are almost incidental. It's Price the cremator, it's Price the nudist, Price the naturist, which is true, he was all of these things, but it's that aspect that gets kind of put front and center. And if his involvement in Newport is ever told, it's the fact that he had to dress up in women's clothing to get out of the country. And that in itself, I think, renders Newport a farcical kind of, ooh, you know, can't we laugh at that aspect of Chartism? But fortunately, there are groups like the one that Les is involved in South Wales who have done brilliant work to get that more, what I would call, authentic, uncomfortable view of the Chartists across. That they're not like us today. I think the problem with history sometimes is it does have that tendency to go, ooh, they were just like us. No, they weren't. So yeah, sorry, I'm babbling, but.
So I'm just wondering if Les James wants to add anything there. Happy to unmute, get you to unmute, Les, if you've got anything you'd like to say.
Okay. How does Matthew? Do you think we should pay more attention to the critics of Chartism, of contemporary critics, who are many, who put forward very strong positions which look very similar to the criticisms most of us on the so-called left are making today about populist politics that's dominating us in the 21st century, Trumpism? Don't you think that there's something to be studied here immediately, that we're, rather than just spending our time the way we are spending our time at the moment, perhaps you should be going back into the past and trying to see whether there's any validity in the worries and concerns about Chartism?
Over to you, Matt. Ooh. He's frozen. Oh, our speaker has frozen on us. Wow, that's a first. I'm glad we got to 3:10 before that happened. Shall we await his return? Oh, no, he's gone. Right. I will carry on for a bit in the hope that he will be able to log back in. I'm going to have to watch out for him in the participants list. So let me just do that. If no, We had another question from Matt Kidd. Matt, I might need you to unmute and answer your own question. Oh no, I think we have lost him. I tell you what I will do at this point. I will take on board. Hopefully, Les, he heard your question and can come back with an answer for you. And I will also take on board the one that that Matt Kidd has put in the chat. If anybody else has any questions, which I can pass on, and then we can.
My internet just broke, but I'm back now.
Oh, you're back. I've been busking it, but yeah,
Sorry about that.
Well done. Right, okay. I'm very relieved to see you. Hello. Did you hear Les's question?
Yeah, he's the bit that before it broke off, he was saying, should we pay more attention to Chartism's critics? And I think he was about to make a comparison with more contemporary criticisms, but he didn't get to finish off that point before my internet went down.
Any more you want to say, Les, before you get an answer from the rejuvenated Matt?
Oh, you're still on mute.
Oh, is it? Right, he's muted.
You're still on mute, Les.
I don't want to hog the show. I was really meaning we have a real serious political problem that's been with us ever since the 19th century, because critics recognized at the time the problem with Chartism. If you give everyone the vote, they may not vote the way the elite want. This is why the elite didn't want to give them the vote. And given what you've said about the diversity of Chartism, and that's important, I think. It was a very diverse movement. Yeah. I think we make all sorts of assumptions as leftists that it was left-wing. And that's my question, really. Wasn't it perhaps a form of Trumpism?
Yeah, it certainly has its populist elements, doesn't it? I mean, if William Lovett was here with us today, I mean, that is exactly what he would say about Fergus O'Connor's brand of Chartism, of irresponsible rhetoric that deliberately riles the masses. I mean, he would have drawn that very parallel, I think, that Les mentioned there, that this is populism and it's dangerous. And that, I don't know, over my history of engaging with Chartism, I've always oscillated between that kind of Lovett-Fabian view and the more O'Connorite one. And I think it probably is time that the pendulum swung back a little bit more towards Lovett and his brand of Chartism, because it foregrounds some of those issues that Les mentioned there. There is a skepticism there, I think, about what a future democracy might look like. This is why it's important that not only do you give people the vote, you educate them, you make them respectable, you stop them from drinking. But of course, you go down that route and you're seen as a puritanical, lefty who speaks to the people as you would have them rather than they actually are. But yeah, that's one of the fundamental tensions, isn't it? The heart of any democracy. Do you force people to vote, go down the Australian route? Well, I don't know. I think sometimes it's best that some people don't engage in politics. But I recognise that's a controversial view as well, because there are some views that are difficult, I think. Yeah, but yeah, I think we probably should try. How we do that in a heritage situation to convey the divisions, debates within Chartism, I think that's more of a challenge. But that's why I like that graphic novel, because it does actually try to get across that Chartists were divided over questions of strategy and tactics, that some of them did favour violence, or at least claimed to use the language of violence to cajole and threaten, but others were not so sure about that. And that's what I really liked about that kind of example, that you're using a story there of different characters. I mean, okay, I'm not saying that they did this. There's a danger with that characters then become sort of mannequins of views, but I don't think they did at all in that graphic novel. I think it's brilliant. And I'm not bothered that the Chartists are leather-clad punks, because it's our history, their story. That's the way it gets squared, I think. So we need more of that kind of, heritage from below, and you're better placed than most to continue facilitating that, I think.
Yeah, we've got some interesting graphic novels coming into the library collection now, and we haven't got the Newport one, so I need to look that one up. And we also haven't got that Rob Sewell book, which is rather terrible. So I've been ordering that during the course of the talk. So as it stands, we've got one more question. So if anybody has a burning question, think of it now, because otherwise this is our last one. There's been a fair amount written about the transition of Chartists into the Liberal Party. With this in mind, did the Liberal Party organise any commemorations of the Chartists?
Yeah. So again, my colleague Tony Taylor has written on this. There's a famous meeting of ex-Chartists at Halifax in 1885, where these old white-haired, greying, balding men, whatever you want to call them, come together. And really, it's a celebration and validation of their reincarnation as respectable, upright Liberal MPs. At least that's the way it's told in the Liberal Party. And this is the problem, that the Liberals, I think, they want to play down the divisions between liberalism and radicalism to make themselves seem more popular. And as I say, you've got ex-Chartists who themselves are playing that game to facilitate their incorporation in a more moderate political party. But yeah, what Tony shows, and I think Robert Hall, as I look at my bookshelf, Robert Hall also wrote a great piece about the Ashton-under-Lyne Chartist, William Aitken, who similarly engages in this sort of post-Chartist, trying to come to terms with his Chartism to facilitate his transition to liberalism, I think. But however much they try to sanitize, they're never entirely successful. You still see evidence of that persistence of a more independent kind of radicalism. And there's also those within the Liberal Party, let's not forget, like Charles Bradlaugh, who go out of their way to invoke memories of Chartism as a way of asserting a kind of independent radicalism to the mainstream insipidness of moderate liberalism. But Bradlaugh's hugely popular. Bradlaugh, of course, first comes to prominence when he hangs around Bonners Fields in London, where he hears Chartists in the late 40s, early 50s still giving haranguing speeches every Sunday morning. So for someone like him, Chartism very much lives on as this independent radicalism. Though I suspect Matthew Kidd will know more about that than I will. I think he was here earlier on.
I did nearly rope him back in when we thought we'd lost you. So now that point when you mentioned the Ashton-under-Lyne Chartists, I could see a library volunteer in Hyde practically leap to attention. If you've got the reference there, I'm sure she'd welcome it. Yeah,
so it's in two publications, one of which was in that Merlin series I mentioned. It's a book called Voices of the People by Robert Hall. And it also appeared as a journal article in the Journal of British Studies in the 1990s. But what I was going to say, if you're one of these unfortunates who don't have access to academic resources, which of course is probably most of you, you wouldn't be able to access the journal article. But at the moment, there is still some relaxing of copyright laws because of the ongoing pandemic. So you may be able to get hold of this academic article if you want it. So if you type in Robert G. Hall, William Aitken, Aitken, into Google, it will probably lead you to that article in Journal of British Studies. But the book will be, probably available for not very much money if you want. It's a very good book because unusually for a historian of Chartism, he takes in both the period of Chartism and the 50 years afterwards as well, which, as I say, is a new area for me, really. I've not done a lot of that.
My typing's not fast enough to check if we've got that in the library catalogue, but I'll be looking for that one later. So now we have got a couple more questions. I have prompted people to do that. So we've still got plenty of people here, so I'm happy to keep going if you've got time, Matt. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Did Robert Owen have a role in Chartism?
Great question. So Robert Owen features as a chapter in my next book, where I'm looking at the role of feeling in popular radicalism. And you can't exclude Owen because his goal is happiness. He tells everybody that if they see the error of their ways and convert to the new religion that his is his socialism, then everyone will be happy. But he never really fully defines what he means by happiness. And there is a sense in which like a lot of us lefties, whilst we're beating ourselves up, he's very good at taking his axe to what he doesn't like. We need to get rid of this, that, and the other, the evils of competition, which make us all unhappy. He doesn't always spend a lot of time talking about what happiness will look like when we finally get it. Owen, I'm conscious of my old tutor at York, Ted Royal, who has argued very powerfully over the years that Owen is not a radical. He's certainly not a Chartist. If anything, he's a Tory radical. He's quite paternalistic. He's a gentleman reformer. I agree with that, maybe as far as Owen's concerned, but you've also got to be aware of the massive movement that grew up around Owen. Sorry, massive is probably the wrong word. The significant movement that grew up around him. Chartism was massive. I don't think Owenism was. It was very big. But as many people here will know, on the local level, activists see no problem with being an Owenite and a Chartist at the same time. And you go to Owenite lectures on Mondays and Sundays. You go to Chartist meetings on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. You probably go to a trade union meeting you can see why some of the Chartist women didn't like their men being involved in all of these. Or some of them did, because it got them out of the house. But yeah, there was always a meeting to turn up to. And we now know, I think a lot more than we once did, just how overlapping these isms are that we as historians and sometimes political leaders like to exaggerate the differences. You get that sort of narcissism of small differences, don't you, which is magnified into an absolute gulf, but in reality, it's not. So that's a convoluted way of saying that I think there are radical aspects to Owen. My lens for making sense of him is I think he's part of a group of radicals that I'm calling ascetic radicals, who have a particular understanding of the role of feeling and the place it should play in politics. It's got a puritanical element to it, as you would expect with asceticism, with its traditions of Christianity, of suffering, of taking, it has to be said, a certain pleasure sometimes in suffering. And I would juxtapose him against what I'm calling sentimental radicals, who are people who wear their hearts on their sleeves more, who do not think that it is their job as a politician to be standing up and telling people how to feel, and they should reform how they feel. And it's very much about, if you're angry, then shout about it, and that is your God-given right to do so. So there's this tension that I'm positing within radicalism in the first half of the 19th century between the ascetic and the sentimental. And just like my three ways of remembering Chartism, of course, these two ways are not always separate. There are overlaps between them. But yeah, watch this space. That's coming out with Manchester University Press. Well, provided no one from MUP is here, I don't think they are. That was due last September, and I think I told them that it would be ready this September, but it's not going to be.
Okay, there's one to look out for from somebody who's right in my eye line and is just up the road from New Lanark. So there we go. That's one for you. So, question about the Sheffield Plot. If the Sheffield Plot had been successful, do you believe that Holbein will be remembered in the same way that other leading Chartists are, or do you think the nature of his death and imprisonment made his impact on the movement more significant, especially in a regional sense?
Yeah. The cynic in me thinks is the death of Holbein more useful to the Chartists as a martyr than he would have been had he sort of succeeded, in inverted commas. There's no doubt that it is the tragedy. And for those of you who don't know, Holbein, the leader of that abortive Sheffield Rising I mentioned, he dies very tragically at the age of 27 because of the harsh conditions he experiences in North Allerton jail, which gives him TB. And then he is latterly moved to York Castle, but it's too late and he dies tragically. And there is something like 20 to 50,000 people who come onto the streets of Sheffield during his funeral, and they literally take over the town for the day. There's a procession out towards the general cemetery where his plot still exists. And without sounding too sentimental, I do like to go and visit it because you can do. It's now heritage from below. Sheffield General Cemetery is a heritage from below project, and it's been opened up to members of the public. There's also a conspiracy theory about Holbury. It's a good article you can read by Catherine Lewis on this that says Holbury had no intention of rising up. It was just a job by the establishment to implicate him and then try him as a sort of lesson, as a kind of exemplary punishment to make the rest of the masses think twice before they rise up. Not sure I entirely believe that. Serious weapons were found in Holbury's home, including grenades, caltrops, the kinds of those sharp objects you throw on the floor to disable cavalry. The horse treads on them, and sharp spike means that the rider falls off. But yeah, as a historian of commemoration, martyrs are central. And Holbury is one of the few Chartists who makes it into the Chartist pantheon of heroes. The reason why that's unusual is it's mostly populated by dead radicals, Thomas Paine, William Cobbett, Henry Hunt. I've got to mention him, given that most of you are probably in Lancashire. But Holbury is one of the few that gets in because it's one of Chartism's own who dies. And he's one of the few working men that get into the pantheon as well. Most of them are gentlemen radicals. So yeah, Holbury's quite interesting, I think. Would he have been more known had he been successful? We've got to ask there, what do we mean by successful? And would he have stood a chance? Would he have stood a hope in hell of being successful? The Newport Rebels had something between 7,000 and 9,000 men marching on the town, and they were unsuccessful. Holbury, I think, was meant to have a few hundred, but only a much smaller number show up. So yeah, you've got to work through sometimes of what would a success have looked like and how long would it have lasted. They'd overpower the local authorities in Sheffield, lay claim to the town hall. How long do you keep hold of that before the various branches of the military arrive? I mean, it's not to say you can't be successful. There are other examples where rebels can keep hold of places, Easter Rising, etc., if only for a period of time. But yeah, from a commemoration point of view, martyrs are more valuable than people who are alive, because once somebody's dead, you can effectively make them say what you want. You can make them represent what it is that you want.
That's an interesting note to end on. I think we are going to end it at that point, unless anybody wants to wave at me frantically. I think people aren't waving. There's some really interesting stuff in the chat, Matt, so I will forward that on to you so that you can see everything that people have been talking about during the course of today. It's fantastic. We've still got 52 people on the talk, but I am going to draw it to a close now. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. As usual, sorry that it's only a virtual round of applause that you're getting here, Matt, but we do very much appreciate the time and the expertise that you've shared with us today. So next week, on Wednesday, the 3rd of March already, we'll be welcoming back library friend and historian Ali Ronan, who will use MI5 papers and other ephemera to piece together the life and times of socialist, anti-fascist and anti-war agitators Phyllis and J. Allen Skinner. A reminder that this talk has been recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly. And also a reminder that our talks are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you are able to do so, and there's a donate button on our website. Thanks again and goodbye. As I always say, until the same time next week, take care, in solidarity, very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thanks for coming, guys.